The storm pressed hard against Vancouver that morning as though the Pacific itself had risen to punish the city. Rain lashed sideways in endless sheets, turning towers of glass into blurred shadows, swallowing the mountains behind veils of fog. The harbor foamed in whitecaps. Gulls wheeled and screamed above the water, and the sidewalks ran like rivers, every drain overflowing. I had not yet poured my first coffee when the pounding began. At first I mistook it for thunder, rolling and insistent, beat. But the rhythm was too steady, too human. My floor vibrated faintly beneath each strike. I froze in the hallway, the cotton robe clutched to my chest, and felt the cold air from the windows seep into my skin. 7 o'clock. Too early for any visitor, much less one who demanded entry with such force. My breath caught, chest tight, and I moved toward the staircase. The railing chilled my palm as I leaned forward, tugging the curtain just enough to see. They were there. My mother stood at the center, her chin tilted skyward, refusing even the rain's authority. The storm plastered her hair to her cheeks, but her posture was unyielding, imperious. Marcus stood to her right, hunched as always, shoulders sagging as if even his skeleton were weary. His wife clung close, her coat hood dripping, while their children shifted and shivered beside stacked luggage. 6 suitcases gleamed dark and swollen on the steps, lined like obedient soldiers. Pajamas peeked from beneath coats. Slippers darkened with water. They had not come for a visit. They had come to stay. The familiar knot twisted deep in my stomach, that coil of dread I had known since childhood. It was the same knot I carried every holiday when my mother announced new rules without warning. The knot that pulsed each time Marcus was praised while I was scolded. The knot that cinched tight whenever my father sighed and told me, "Not worth the fight." My body remembered before my mind did when she appeared uninvited. The storm was never just outside. I lingered at the window, holding my breath as the pounding continued. For decades, I had rushed to meet such sounds, to throw open doors, to absorb demands before they became unbearable. That had been my role, self-erasure as shield. But this time I did not move. My phone lit on the kitchen counter across the room, buzzing. My father's name glowed. Not hers. She was not calling me. She was calling him. She was. Her voice cut through the storm, pitched high enough to travel across the street. "Your daughter has locked us out. We're stranded in the rain with the children. She refuses to let us in." Each word was a spear hurled at me, though her gaze fixed on the phone. She knew I was listening. She knew I would hear. She always knew. And as she spoke, neighbors turned their heads. A man with a red umbrella slowed, pretending to check his watch. Curtains shifted in windows across the street. She had her audience. My father's message buzzed through, "Let them in. Don't make a scene." The scene was hers, yet the blame, as always, was mine. My breath stuttered, and suddenly I was 8 again, standing at the fogged window of our modest house in Burnaby. Snow fell in heavy flakes, the kind that muffled the world into softness. Children shouted in the cul-de-sac, rolling snow into great spheres, dragging sleds up the small hill. I pressed mittened hands against the glass, aching to join them. But behind me, her voice snapped the laundry basket overflowed, the baseboards gathered dust. Marcus had already dashed outside, shrieking with laughter, snow in his hair. I was handed a vacuum hose instead of mittens. My first lesson in inequality had tasted like dust. At 12, the lesson sharpened. The winter dance was approaching, whispered about in hallways, girls comparing sequins on lunch breaks. I had saved babysitting money for a dress, dared to paint my nails, dared to feel anticipation. But that afternoon, my mother scanned the kitchen, spotted crumbs near the toaster, and delivered her judgment, "You are not going." I begged. Tears streaking, but her mouth tightened into stone. My father drove me to school the next morning, eyes fixed on the road, lips pressed white. His only words, "Not worth the fight." The phrase became my inheritance. At 15, a friend invited me on a ski trip to Whistler. Marcus went snowboarding that weekend with teammates, funded cheerfully, praised for his athleticism. I stayed home scrubbing the bathroom tiles, my allowance withheld when I asked why. The following winter, at 17, I won a scholarship essay contest. The ceremony fell on a Saturday evening. My mother declared we would host relatives that night, insisted it was too inconvenient to reschedule. I took the bus alone, accepted my plaque with trembling hands, then rode home to a sink piled high with dishes. My father kissed my forehead absently, murmuring that keeping her calm was more important than celebrating me. Year after year, the bricks stacked higher, building the cage I carried with me. Now, through the rain-smeared window, I saw my mother tilt her chin higher, raising her voice to the audience of strangers. Marcus shifted from foot to foot. His wife whispered to the children, one perched on a suitcase, another tugging at her sleeve. My father's texts stacked across my phone screen, and I knew with a certainty sharp as the storm if I opened that door, I would once again surrender my life to theirs. The rain pounded, you relentless, my hand trembled, but instead of moving toward the door, I turned away. I placed my phone face down on the counter and let it buzz unanswered. That silence rang louder than any storm. It pulled up other memories, flooding me with their weight. At 20, racked with pneumonia, I lay fevered beneath blankets, bones aching. The doctor had ordered rest, silence, no stress. But the house roared with music and laughter, wine poured freely for my mother's co-workers. I stumbled from my room, blanket dragging, hair soaked with sweat. She beamed in the center of the living room, glass raised, while strangers danced. My father leaned at the fireplace, nodding politely. His eyes slid past me as if I were invisible. When I asked him later why he hadn't intervened, his fingers pressed to his temples. Not worth the fight. That phrase haunted my 20s. It hovered when I failed an exam after being coerced into babysitting Marcus's children. It whispered when I skipped job shifts to chauffeur my mother on errands. It hissed in every silence my father offered instead of protection. And now it perched again. But this time my silence was not surrender, it was defiance. Outside, the storm wore on. My mother's voice pierced higher, claiming suffering, claiming victimhood, weaving her narrative for the neighbors. She knew exactly what she was doing. The red umbrella man lingered, curiosity in his sideways glance. Curtains quivered across the street. Shame was her currency, and she spent it lavishly. But I no longer had change to give. The pounding slowed as evening drew near. Eventually their figures retreated, shadows dissolving into the mist. My steps echoed strangely in the quiet apartment, every nerve still wired with tension. But I did not move toward the door, I did not answer the phone, I let the silence hold me. It was the first act of resistance in my entire life. For 2 days after the storm, silence cloaked my apartment. No fists rattled the door, no voices pierced the glass. Only the hum of the refrigerator, the steady tick of the wall clock, and the faint hiss of rain subsiding into mist. The quiet felt alien, like stepping into a house after a crowd has left, echoes still reverberating. My nerves were raw, tuned to expect another pounding at any moment, but the steps remained empty. The suitcases had vanished. My phone lay mute on the counter, though the backlog of unanswered calls glared each time I passed it. On the third morning, a gentle knock at the back door startled me. I braced, pulse pounding, until I saw Sophie's familiar face through the glass. She carried a paper bag, the top folded neatly, steam escaping faintly. Pastries. She had always known to bring sweetness at the sharpest times. She lived only a few blocks away now, though we had drifted since university, yet somehow she appeared precisely when I needed her most. Her words, spoken quietly over coffee at my table, cut deeper than any storm. Marcus and his wife had rented their house on Airbnb for 2 months. Their sudden appearance on my steps had not been an accident of misfortune, it was strategy. They had secured income elsewhere and expected me to serve as their free accommodation, their unpaid caretaker, their silent solution. The revelation hollowed me out. Betrayal pressed into my ribs like a blade. My mother's performance, my father's text, Marcus's silence, all of it had been scaffolding around this plan. I thought of my father's tone on the phone, not surprised, not shocked, merely weary. He had known. He had let it unfold. His silence was not ignorance. It was complicity. The memories cascaded again, heavier than before. At 21, during finals at the University of British Columbia, my mother called 3 times in 1 week. Clara, Marcus's wife, she needed rest, his age, and I was good with children. I explained each time that exams loomed, that I could not afford distraction. Each time my father's voice followed hers on the line, just help this once, your mother is tired, you'll manage, I babysat. I failed 1 course, the lost credits stretched my degree another semester. To them, never mattered. At 24, I landed an internship downtown, a rare chance at stability. The schedule was brutal, but it could open doors. My mother called at midnight one Thursday. The fridge had broken, and she demanded I drive to fetch a replacement before morning. I explained I had an early presentation. My father's voice again, not worth the fight. Just go. I went. I arrived late, exhausted. The opportunity slipped away. At 27, pneumonia struck, and I lay sweating in my childhood bedroom. The doctor warned against stress, demanded rest. That very night, my mother hosted a gathering. Laughter and music roared through the walls while I shook beneath blankets. I staggered to the doorframe, saw her radiant in the living room, glass in hand, my father polite by the fireplace. He looked at me once, I then looked away. No protection, I got no protest. His silence was louder than the party itself. At 30, I underwent surgery, a wound that demanded solitude to heal. I begged for quiet, for space, for 1 month to recover. 2 weeks later, my mother arrived with boxes of Marcus's belongings, insisting he needed storage. My father's voice came again, tired, pleading. She means well, don't cause conflict. The weight of their needs crushed the air from my lungs. And now, at 33, after decades of yielding, I saw the full pattern illuminated. Their demands were never random. They were designed, orchestrated, reinforced by silence. My mother manipulated, my father enabled, and I was cast as the eternal solution. But Sophie's revelation shifted something fundamental. I saw that my compliance was not kindness, it was sustenance for their hunger. Without my surrender, their machine ground to a halt. On the 4th day, I visited the rental office of a brick building in Mount Pleasant. The manager slid papers across the table. My name inked every page, all alone. Unqualified, all. Each signature carved a new boundary. The pen felt heavy. I weighted with the years I had lived for others. When the final copy slid back, stamped and sealed, I felt the air change. That afternoon, a locksmith arrived. He knelt at my door, tools clicking, metal shifting, each turn of his wrist stitched shut an old wound. I watched rain mist the window and thought, this is what freedom sounds like. Not applause, not praise, but the quiet grind of a new lock sliding into place. Still, my phone buzzed. My father's voice returned, softer, coaxing. He spoke of appearances, of shame, of the neighbors' whispers. He said family must endure together. He said selfishness was unbecoming. But his words washed against me without sinking. Because by then I had found my grandmother's papers. They were tucked in a folder, edges yellowing, her handwriting steady and firm. Instructions, conditions, She had foreseen this hunger in my mother, this devouring pattern. She wrote that property and inheritance would never pass to those who violated boundaries. She wrote that love must not consume. She wrote that silence by some, when used against the vulnerable, was betrayal. Reading her words was like stepping into sunlight after decades underground. She had known, she had seen me, she had left proof that resistance was not cruelty, but survival. I held the papers in trembling hands, tears streaking, and felt her presence. My grandmother had drawn a map I could follow. When my father called again, I answered once. His sigh was familiar, heavy. He spoke of harmony, of peace, of my mother's exhaustion. I interrupted gently, voice steady. I told him his silence was not neutrality but agreement. Then I hung up. For the first time, the silence afterward belonged to me. Days stretched into weeks. Without my compliance, my mother's performances collapsed. Without my surrender, their plan dissolved. No more pounding fists, no more raised voices. The neighbors' curiosity faded. The block returned to normal, and in that quiet, I discovered myself. I brewed coffee bitter, the way I preferred, unsoftened for anyone else. I ate when hungry, not when meals were demanded. I bought a chair I liked, placed it by the window, and read in the light without interruption. I hung my grandmother's photograph on the wall, her face serene in a garden long vanished. Her eyes seemed to meet mine, affirming what I had always known but never dared act upon. Boundaries are not betrayals. They are lifelines. One evening, the phone rang again. This time, both voices filled the line on speaker, my mother sharp, my father weary. They spoke of children crying, of neighbors whispering, of selfishness. They spoke of betrayal, but I sat at my table, the lease papers beneath my hand, the keys on the counter, the locks newly fitted, and realized their voices no longer owned me. I listened until they paused for breath. Then I spoke calmly. Each word deliberate, I was no longer their solution, the silence that followed was not heavy. Hollow. I ended the call. That night, rain began again, softer now, no longer needles but rhythm. It tapped against my windows like a heartbeat. I curled into my chair, coffee cooling at my side, the keys resting in my palm, my grandmother's face glowing in the lamplight. For the first time, the storm outside was only weather. It no longer mirrored the storm within. My silence was not compliance, it was freedom. And it belonged to me.